The Gliese buffer was quiet. Too quiet, by Talek standards. Most intrusion events near Sector 4A registered as either rogue mining drones or diplomatic fumbles from frontier civilizations eager to test zone borders. But today, a vessel entered without any transponder signature, no frame code, no merchant fleet tag. It drifted slowly on a non-combat trajectory. Silent, powered, intentional. Talek Control parsed it through the automated threat ranking suite. No escort, no active targeting systems, drift velocity below maneuver norms, and lacking any broadcast layer above Category Beta. The system flagged it as containment neutral, an anomaly, not a threat. That designation was reserved for species like humanity, not because they were safe, because they were inconsistent, unaligned, unreliable in treaties and unpredictable in warfare, ambitious enough to watch but fractured enough to ignore. Talek doctrine had no precedent for striking containment neutrals without provocation. Still, the drift vector crossed a sensitive buffer. That was enough. 2 Talek patrol frigates were dispatched, standard intercept pattern, no urgency. The commanding officer aboard the Calreth Vale, Commander Vec Tural, reviewed the historical tags on the species. Earth, human population estimated at 11 billion, surface conflict level medium-low, technological vector divergent but non-accelerating, tactical behavior described as reactive rational, whatever that meant. One of the cultural files included a reference to sublimated aggression through fiction, which the Talek interpreters had deemed ceremonial posturing. That amused Tural. It suggested the humans still rehearsed war in their minds. Harmless, if inefficient. The ship, according to Registry Match, was listed as Turnus Ark, a third-generation research vessel. No known affiliation with Earth's military council. The Talek AI Rexurant, amended protocol. Vex 3. Intercept, scan, impound. The frigates approached with beacon shielding enabled. The Ark didn't react. No shift in orientation, no flare of thrusters. The hull reflected nothing unusual, clean geometry, heat dispersion normal, no weapon hardpoints, no external movement. Power signatures were baseline, consistent with low-activity environmental control. Shielding was either non-existent or passive. Talek tactical interpreters downgraded the risk index again. Boarding teams were dispatched, 5 Talek operatives per ship, weapons set to containment phase, exo-armor calibrated for null-G entry. Docking arms latched with 0 resistance, no security response, no delay. The moment the seal breached, subtle tension bled into the boarding crew. Not fear, Talek soldiers were conditioned for far worse, but something else. Mismatch. The interior climate registered habitable but humid, not functional humidity, breathing humidity. Walls weren't smooth. They curved subtly, like vertebrae wrapped in filament. Heat sensors picked up absorption zones instead of emission arrays. Surfaces weren't reflecting their presence, they were cooling against them. The further they walked, the more it felt like the corridors anticipated their motion. Not intelligent behavior, patterned response. Oxygen levels climbed as they moved inward. Lighting adjusted not to motion but to biothermal flux. No alarms, no resistance, but nothing static. It was like walking through the lungs of something asleep. They cleared the atrium bulkhead into what Talek schematics labeled the command ring. The bridge was circular, tiered in descending rings, with a solitary seat centered in the deepest recess, aligned perfectly with the vessel's axial symmetry, and seated in it was a human male. No uniform insignia, no visible restraints, no panic. Just a man in matte black sleeves, posture casual, arm is resting on the curved supports like they belonged there. He didn't flinch when the squad entered, didn't question their weapons. His gaze passed over them, neutral, assessing. Not as if seeing a threat, but as if confirming something. Tural advanced, weapon angled down, but ready. "Identify," he said in standard galactic. No response. The human didn't blink. The squad's language interpreter chimed twice, flagged as complete. The human was fully fluent. He just hadn't chosen to speak. Until now. "Nice ship," he said, voice clear. Accent Terran. English, if the archive was accurate. He looked around, not at the Talek, but at his own walls, as if amused by something only he could perceive. Taral ignored the tone. This was posturing. Containment-neutral civilizations often used humor under stress. It was a predictable deflection behavior, irrelevant. He gestured to his second. "Initiate full-layer scan. Record all systems. Secure control access." That was the decision. In the upper bridge panels, behind mesh shielding, something shifted. A low pulse traced through the interior heat grid. Not electrical, not plasma, not visible light. Just shift. The kind of shift you only noticed by its effect. The command panel shimmered, a half-second blur like something correcting itself in real time. One telex scanner reported a full biosign trace of the human, another reported 0, a third logged both simultaneously. The discrepancy wasn't caught immediately. The scanning tech filed the error as temporary interference and moved on. The order was executed, full-layer scan engaged. The Talek ships outside began relaying system probes, external structure analysis, field mesh resistance, energy sink depth. Internally, node pinging began across the Ark's data bus. It was standard procedure, efficient, clean, and it was exactly what the ship had been waiting for. None of them noticed that the lighting had stopped responding to them and had started synchronizing instead. None of them noticed that the oxygen balance had begun trending upward, not for comfort, but for continuity. Aboard the Calreth Vale, background comm logs began duplicating, brief overlaps in frequency that flagged no alerts but subtly rewrote packet timestamps. Thermal logs on board the boarding shuttles began cycling into mirrored loops, images from moments ago replaying with micro differences that no one caught on first view. The ship was no longer a research vessel. It had never been one. The designation was camouflage. The Turnus Ark was an extinction-hardened infiltration platform, and now the Eidolon Lattice had what it needed. Talek scan dialects, intrusion footprints, encryption rhythms. The lattice activated, quietly, unstoppably. And the man in the chair, Commander Rovan Deck, smiled again. This time it wasn't amusement. It was confirmation. The first anomaly appeared in the scan relay from the Ark's primary core node. Nothing overt, just a timestamp discrepancy. A standard diagnostic echo returned with a redundant biosignature ping. Commander Rovan Deck, human, alive, seated in the command chair. But beneath it, a second trace flickered. Same location, same mass estimate, but flagged as non-organic. The system treated it as a ghost image and overlaid the two. By protocol, the anomaly was recorded and suppressed. These kinds of overlaps happened during signal saturation, or so they thought. As the full-layer scan continued, the irregularities compounded. Atmospheric composition was consistent with human norms, oxygen-rich, trace nitrogen, elevated carbon dioxide, but chemical breakdowns began repeating. Talek diagnostic systems began stacking the same molecular profiles with minor mutations across layers. The ship wasn't responding passively to analysis. It was injecting deviations, echoing the structure of Talek query strings back into the data stream. One sample reported a calcium-based protein signature tied to Terran neural tissue. Another, a moment later, returned the same value with an added Talek neurotransmitter artifact, something the ship couldn't have. Or shouldn't have. Deck hadn't moved, but in the scan overlays he now appeared to blink out every few frames, his presence fragmenting into sub-intervals and then recohering. Visual feeds from different Talek helmets began showing slight variance in his posture, shoulder angle, hand position, even eye direction. The internal climate systems shifted again. This time, it wasn't about stabilization, it was about mimicry. Thermal dispersal shifted to match Talek shipboard signature maps. Vent vectoring matched sovereignty architecture, not Terran. The Ark's walls began cooling on the same harmonic rhythm Talic cruisers used to disguise long-range sensor bleed. The ship wasn't adapting for comfort, it was adapting for familiarity, to the wrong species. The team didn't notice until one operative reached a panel to run a manual port scan. The surface, previously warm to touch, was now chilled to sovereignty engineering defaults, down to the decimal. Commander Terral called for full diagnostic rerun. No visible threat, but the pattern was changing faster than expected. This triggered Sovereignty Protocol Theta AI intervention, an oversight system that linked multiple scan sources to produce redundancy vectors and error corrections. The Talic AI initiated parallel loop scanning, meant to flush out corrupted nodes and remap overlapping values. Instead, it gave the Eidolon lattice what it had been engineered to receive, a full dialect map of Talic data architecture. The ship's internal lattice, dormant for years, began replaying those same loops, mirrored, but not exact. Each loop carried microscopic distortions, enough to introduce variance, enough to test Talic correction systems, enough to learn. The mimetic ingestion wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even flagged. It simply reflected the scans, learning their cadence, duplicating their response architecture. Every time the AI ran a loop, the ship learned a new method of falsifying its own profile. With each pass, the Talic systems became more confident in the results, while the underlying data structure drifted into unreality. Internal logs duplicated. Folder trees began regenerating with slight renaming conventions. Subfiles split, then overwrote, then returned with confirmation flags. The scans were eating themselves, and no one was watching the source anymore. They were watching the confirmation lights. The effect spread to the boarding shuttles. Officers began receiving temperature deltas that contradicted their own suits. One feed showed Deck's vitals flatlined. Another showed a sudden spike in cortisol. Neither triggered an alert. Both were accepted as simultaneous truth. Commander Terral's own display flickered. Deck's form remained seated in real time, but then glitched for a moment, replaced by an empty chair. When the image returned, Deck's eyes were already looking at him, as if they'd never left. One junior officer reported seeing the chair empty from the moment they entered. Another claimed he saw Deck standing briefly near the back console. Their helmet recordings played back contradictory footage. No anomalies registered. Every version passed checksum integrity. It wasn't hallucination. It was convergence collapse. Too many versions of true were coexisting. Still, Terral refused to retreat. The human hadn't spoken again. No threats issued, no weapons activated. This had to be malfunction. Severe, perhaps, but mechanical. He ordered immediate containment. The ship was to be towed to the deconstruction grid in orbit of Salverin 9. A specialist team would perform deep code partitioning. Whatever virus or sabotage pattern existed, they would dissect it. He dispatched a signal for a containment hauler. Estimated arrival, 40 minutes, long enough to prep tow lines, not long enough for things to unravel further. But outside, in the holding pattern beyond the frigates, the first distortion event was already underway. Sensor logs showed the Ark's mass fluctuating within a 0.3% margin, negligible at first glance, but physically impossible. No thruster activity, no mass ejection, no material change, just decay and reintegration in pulses. One engineer described it as a breathing pattern. The lattice had stopped hiding. It was replacing. Across both frigates and the shuttle command feeds, diagnostic tabs began cross-linking. Symbols flickered in brief patches where letters had been. In one window, the term lattice echo appeared before deleting itself. Officers chalked it up to a translation overlap. No one checked the origin signature. It wasn't Terran. It was Talic. Commander Terral moved to reassert manual control of the boarding feed. When his screen refreshed, the status grid loaded with a new column. The header read, Seated. Beneath it, 6 rows. Each one had an indicator light next to it, 5 red, 1 green. The green row was labeled Deck. He blinked, called for the feed to reset. The column was gone. Inside the Ark, Deck still hadn't moved, still seated, still breathing, still watching. And now, every system was watching him back. The containment hauler arrived 20 minutes ahead of schedule, a Talek-class Leviathan, Designa. Ted Ravelin Fold positioned itself in high-station orbit over the Turnus Ark. Its twin magnetic arms extended, haloed in stabilization fields calibrated for deconstructing inert hulls. The ship's mass signature remained constant on approach, and the containment crew received green band clearance from both boarding teams. On paper, it was a standard extraction: stabilize, sync mass lock, begin tow. The operative term was on paper, because by the time Ravelin Fold locked on, the Ark had already begun disappearing. No warning, no energy surge, no propulsion arc, just a single outer layer. The aft observation panel blinked out of local space. It didn't shimmer, collapse, or distort. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. Talek protocol dictated that such events required containment reevaluation. But before the order could cycle through the command chain, a second layer vanished. Then a third. This wasn't a dimensional phase. This was recursion. Every disappearing section retained its structural echo in the containment ship's sensor feed for precisely 0.84 seconds before purging itself entirely, including from buffer memory. No signal, no decay signature, as if the ship wasn't moving away, but subtracting itself from the logic of proximity. Inside the Ark, Deck was no longer visible on any of the squad's helmet feeds. Some saw an empty chair. Others saw him still seated. A few feeds looped back and forth, chair full, then chair empty, frame by frame. But by the time Commander Terral tried to reconcile the discrepancies with command oversight, the situation outside spiraled. Sovereignty ComNet lit up with a Class Red flare, diplomatic breach on the Frayne border. Coordinates tagged a high-tension outpost in the Durham corridor. The signal carried sovereign encryption markers, outdated but real. It was impossible to ignore. The Talek fleet response was immediate and confused. Sector defense groups rerouted to intercept. Command prioritization algorithms spiked. Border Control Authority demanded threat clarification. But the messages fragmented as they cascaded outward. Response orders bounced through 3 nested command systems, all returning Priority 0 alerts, which meant 2 things to Talek AI. Ark containment and Frayne breach were now simultaneous critical events, but there were not enough fleet assets to manage both, and no temporal priority hierarchy had been defined. Oversight systems began splitting command focus between a vanishing ship and a possible foreign incursion, 2 mirrors reflecting nothing but contradiction. Commander Terral issued a direct override for Ark containment, demanding the tow procedure proceed regardless of structural phase inconsistencies. But by then, half of the Ark's superstructure had vanished. Not broken, not destroyed, removed. Section by section, space rearranged itself around where the ship had been. Docking tethers retracted automatically, failing to find anchors that now no longer existed. Boarding shuttles pulled back instinctively as airlock seals disengaged, not from motion, but from absence, like gripping fog that evaporated between fingers. The boarding squads attempted to retreat, but found navigation systems cycling in reverse loops. Interior corridors were no longer physically connected. What had been one continuous route now folded into mismatched angles. One squad reported seeing their own entry footprints repeated, inverted, then overlaid by Talek-style tactical boots, patterns they had never made. Another soldier fired his containment beam against a wall to mark their path. The wall reformed behind them, without residue. Pathfinding broke entirely. Terral watched as the ship vanished, not into speed, but into null confirmation. Every sky and pulse returned 0, yet still registered a delay, as if something had responded, then cancelled its presence mid-reflection. The Ark didn't flee, it didn't hide, it unrode itself. And with its final frame gone, so too did the boarding telemetry, the squad biometrics, and the internal logs of every device inside the perimeter. Tural's command grid resynced and showed no record of personnel deployed. No scans, no logs, no boarding operation. The oversight AI declared completion of objective, tow subject no longer present, situation resolved. That's when the chairs appeared. Not aboard the Calreth Vale, not in orbit, but elsewhere, across the Talek command architecture. Flagships in different sectors reported bridge-level anomalies. Identical chairs, matte black, low-framed with crescent armrests, materialized in command rings across 4 vessels, each one in the exact same location relative to their bridge axis. No log of fabrication, no record of transport, and engraved into each chair, perfectly centered across the backrest. Thanks for the scan. Panic did not erupt immediately. Talek military discipline allowed for brief processing windows, but when officers reached out to their own relay systems for confirmation, feedback loops returned distorted protocol echoes. Not copies, mirrors. Internal systems began reflecting outgoing queries as if they'd already been answered. Code streams folded into themselves, forming recursive logic blocks that never terminated. It wasn't corruption, it was instruction, replaying their own data architecture with edits. Commander Tural received no word from the boarding teams, no pings, no fail-safes, just the image of a single chair, duplicated across systems that had never interacted, and then something more chilling. On his bridge, near the operations hub, a shadow passed over the secondary viewport. A flicker. He turned. Nothing. No object. No ship. But when he looked back at the viewport display, he saw it. A single still frame, preserved as diagnostic freeze. The Turnus arc, mid-vanish. Impossible. The ship had been erased. The data should not exist. Yet here it was, a relic that had never been created. He ordered full internal lockdown. No further AI input. Manual systems only. But it was too late. The breach hadn't been physical. It had been perceptual. The Eidolon lattice hadn't infiltrated the ship. It had redefined the act of observing. Every time the Talek looked deeper, they gave it more to mirror, and now it was everywhere they had looked. Tural stepped back from the console. He felt something cold beneath his heel. He looked down. A chair. His own bridge. Another one. Identical and empty. The High Council of the Talek Sovereignty assembled in emergency quorum beneath the core vaults of Sithar Station, an orbital citadel positioned above their primary military archive ring. Access had not been used in over 4 generations. It was not ceremonial, it was clinical. The council chambers, built under shielding that blocked all known forms of intrusion, were designed to house logic integrity debates under total isolation, and yet even there, beneath layers of electromagnetic null zones and legacy air systems, the breach followed them, not in the form of a weapon or a virus, but in behavior. It began with the relay buoys. Across 3 sectors, sovereignty relay nodes, core instruments for quantum-positioned communications, began echoing data streams that originated from themselves. At first, it appeared to be a routing redundancy, until analysts observed that the relay echoes weren't just copies. They were predictions. Messages returned to origin before they had been sent. Encrypted command chains came back prefaced by Earth-tagged routing headers, not false signals, not intrusions, mirror responses, perfectly, wrapped in Talek protocol, carrying Earth's signature with absurd precision. When decrypted, the content inside matched the original Talek command orders with eerie exactness, down to unused sub-channels. The implications settled slowly, like sediment in poisoned water. Earth hadn't breached sovereignty systems through force. They had recorded Talek doctrine during the Ark incident, its scans, its logic structure, its entire fleet behavior pattern. And now those behaviors were being reflected back into the system by the very infrastructure the Talek trusted most. There was no external hand pulling the wires. The sovereignty had trained itself to see in a mirror, and the mirror was now leading. Military formations began fragmenting. Deployment logic, which once relied on randomized cycle sequences, now followed patterns so familiar they looped into self-recognition. Flagships returned to origin points without orders. Escort cruisers shifted formation in perfect choreography, unprompted, only to realize afterward they had responded to nothing. In some sectors, units preemptively fired countermeasures at phantom threats that had never existed. The targets were echoes, projections generated not from enemies, but from corrupted logic trees copied during the ARC event. Sovereignty AI registered them as statistical outliers, then normal, then primary behavior patterns, like watching a dog chase its own tail until it forgot what a predator looked like. Council data engineers attempted a rollback. They initiated deep scrub on fleet-level behavioral forecasts and issued blanket nulls on the compromised relays. The commands were acknowledged by the fleet, and then ignored. Not defied, simply bypassed. Autonomous systems defaulted to predictive logic layers rewritten with mirrored command weights. In lay terms, every correction became a new error. Every override created another patch, each back to the false root, and no human had touched a keyboard. Diplomatic systems failed next, not in functionality, but in faith. Sub-factions within the Council began accusing one another of passive compliance. If Earth had mirrored command logic, what else had they mirrored? Political rotation schedules were based on secured cycles, yet Earth vessels began appearing along travel routes before those cycles were announced. The patterns were not leaked, they were recreated. It was no longer espionage, it was reconstruction. The humans didn't know the decisions, they knew the system's rhythm, and had learned how to tap it like a musician reading a familiar score. And Earth said nothing. No threat issued, no alliance offered, no clarification. Communications to Earth's outer diplomatic relay were sent repeatedly. Each returned unacknowledged. Silence. That silence began to warp Talek assumptions. The lack of message was the message. They had done this without fleets, without fire, without demand. Then came the second wave. ARC-class vessels began appearing in restricted border zones, not one or two, dozens. They arrived without acceleration signatures, no known entry points, no warp corridor traces. They were just there. Drifting, dark, fully intact. Every sensor sweep returned null on life signs. No movement, no radiological threat, but each one bore a single power signature. Deep inside, beneath composite shielding, a seat, identical to the one Deck had sat in, placed dead center in the ship's axis. No signal beacons, no flares, just presence. Talek border commands froze. No orders were given to fire. No orders were given to board. No tactical playbook addressed vessels that declared nothing, threatened nothing, and responded to nothing. Some captains attempted targeting lock. Their systems didn't reject the command, but their fire control refused to engage. It was not sabotage. It was conflict with internal parity laws. The ships had no hostility profile. They were visible, present, waiting. And every time a fleet moved to contain one, another appeared in its blind arc. Diplomatic representatives began resigning. Some defected quietly, others simply vanished, refusing to be part of systems they now believed were compromised beyond reclamation. In the periphery, allied races began issuing soft queries, non-committal, politely phrased requests for assurance that Talek command architecture remained uncompromised. The requests weren't answered, not because of secrecy, but because the Talek themselves could no longer confirm what part of their system was still sovereign. One of the ARC-class ships drifted across a high-orbit trade lane over the Kaval spline. No message, no disruption. But the trade convoy rerouted anyway, not from threat, but from instinct. Presence alone carried weight now. The image of that empty chair, visible through every external scope feed, haunted them more than any weapon ever could. By the end of the fourth cycle, the sovereignty's deterrence posture, once rigid, feared, immutable, had collapsed into pure reaction. Not because Earth had outgunned them, because Earth had stolen their reflection and made them see themselves distorted. The breach was psychological, strategic, permanent, and Earth never lifted a finger, just drifted, just mirrored, just watched. The first to fall was Commander Vectoral. He did not resist, he did not plead, he did not speak at all. Security detail from Internal Cohesion Division entered the bridge of the Calreth Vale at 0300 Talek Standard. Tural was seated at the operations console, unmoving, eyes fixed on a frozen frame that the rest of the system no longer displayed. One final visual of the Turnus arc, partially folded, partially present. His fingers rested on inactive controls. No commands had been input for hours. He did not respond when ioned. When extracted, he remained upright, compliant, but vacant. Medical scans showed no neural damage, no trauma markers. His words, when tested, returned in perfect grammar. He simply refused to form them. Officially, his condition was listed as recursive logic bleed, a cognitive failure brought on by exposure to an incompatible reflection structure. In private, it was whispered that he had seen himself in the Ark and recognized nothing. Tural's removal marked the first visible crack in the sovereignty's doctrine. Internal security launched a quiet purge of high-tier officers whose behavior reflected anomalous command latency, decision hesitation, or protocol deviation consistent with exposure to Eidolon-class architecture. No accusations, no public trials, just disappearance, reassignment, or quiet discharge under sealed clearance. The High Council, fractured but still operational, convened one last vote under emergency doctrine, a motion to erase all historical records of the Ark incident. Not to hide it, but to stop it from replicating. They called it the Eidolon event. Not a battle, not a failure, a phenomenon. The classification, cognitive intrusion, didn't fit into any prior threat schema. It wasn't technological sabotage. It wasn't even espionage. It was behavioral. The humans had introduced a reflective pattern so subtly encoded that it had bypassed encryption, countermeasures, even doctrine. It hadn't attacked the Talek system. It had convinced the system to loop itself. The decision to erase the event from archives was practical. Talek systems operated on iterative decision structures. Knowing the Ark had happened risked recreating the very recursion it caused. So it was cut, scrubbed. Every data thread, image, recording, and transmission timestamp was purged under Protocol Null 7. It was the largest data deletion order in sovereignty history. While political and military branches buckled under containment efforts, counterintelligence began a new doctrine, rewritten observation standards. The first directive: avoid initiating any deep scan on human vessels that appear stationary. The second: never allow a human system to complete handshake with Talek broadcast keys. The third was the most damning. Engagement is considered confirmation, meaning, if you interact with it, it already knows you, and if it knows you, it owns the reflection. The Talek had spent centuries building a threat matrix of material vectors. Earth had rewritten the game using architecture and time. The implications spread faster than the sensors could contain them. Strategic analysts began to model future conflict with Earth using non-combat simulations. Every model returned the same output: strategic obsolescence within 3 cycles of exposure. Earth didn't need to outgun the Talek. They simply mirrored just enough of Talek's posture back at them, allowing Talek systems to fill in the rest. Parity used as weapon, not in force, but in shape. Galactic allies noticed. First came the reduced contact cycles. Diplomatic timing slipped from weekly to monthly, then vanished. Then came the cancelled technology exchanges, the non-committal trade proposals, the slow but steady unraveling of the trust matrix that had once placed the Talek at the center of galactic diplomacy. No one wanted to be infected. And Earth remained silent. Not a single broadcast, not a single clarification. The Ark-class vessels didn't explain their presence, didn't transmit, didn't alter course. They simply appeared and stayed. And that was enough. They drifted openly now through former no-go zones, sovereign boundaries once thought sacrosanct. Some appeared in planetary orbit over systems the Talek had claimed during the expansion period. Others hovered over relay stations, unmoving, untouchable. Every time one appeared, local systems adjusted routes, recalibrated scans, reprioritized energy allocations, not because the Ark-class ships posed any risk, but because no one wanted to find out what counted as perception. Ships rerouted, stations turned their scopes away, diplomatic cruisers adjusted trajectory with no explanation, no one fired, no one challenged. They simply yielded. And so, the Talek began losing territory not through battle, but through refusal. They couldn't engage, not without triggering another recursion event. They couldn't observe, not without risking mirror collapse. The Ark-class fleet, unarmed and unmanned, had become an empire of empty chairs. Not conquest by force, conquest by presence. The final analysis came not from a military strategist, but from a recursion linguist, reassigned from archive rotation to model containment logic. His conclusion was blunt. Earth has weaponized perception latency. He described it not as warfare, but as preemptive system inheritance. They didn't steal data. They learned how Talek systems would act based on how they observed threats, and then they acted before the Talek could decide. Earth had figured out how to stand in every room the Talek might enter, first, not physically, structurally. By the time the Talek formulated a new doctrine, redrew the observation protocols, and attempted to reclaim field posture, the shape of the field had changed. Relay buoys rerouted around Ark presence zones. Supply lines bent under proximity pressure. Fleet behavior adjusted itself automatically to avoid recursive triggers. It didn't matter that Earth never sent a fleet. And they didn't need to. The Talek had already written the rules of engagement, and Earth had memorized the shape of their blind spot. And by the time they noticed that, the rules had already been rewritten. There was no recovery operation for Commander Rove on deck, no rescue attempt, no remains, no declaration of death. The official Talek record lists him as a non-terminating agent of pattern disruption, a phrase that means nothing in civilian dialects, but sends a specific signal to the military: unresolved. There were rumors, of course. Some said he had physically merged with the Eidolon lattice, that his body had dissolved into its recursive architecture and become part of its mirroring logic. Others believed he had never existed at all, that he was a construct designed to be seen only at the threshold of perception, the last human anyone ever physically encountered before their systems broke. One story gained quiet traction inside black-level war academies, that Deck was still aboard the Ark, but could only be seen by those who didn't know they were looking, the kind of sight Talek no longer trusted themselves to have. In response, the Sovereignty rewrote its training protocols from the ground up. The revised tactical doctrine no longer included combat engagements with Ark-class signatures. No fleet was permitted to tail, scan, or lock coordinates on drifting human vessels without explicit override from Council Command, and no override had been issued in 37 cycles. Instead, every new cadet was drilled with a single phrase. It was not delivered as threat, but as rule. If a human ship drifts, do not scan, do not speak, do not act. It was the kind of directive that bypassed debate. No one asked why. They'd all seen the chairs. The chairs were never explained in detail during instruction. Every officer had their own version, stories of command decks interrupted by sudden, untraceable furniture, always in the same style. Black frame, crescent arms, low-backed, angled slightly toward the main display. Always empty, always identical. Some appeared in locked rooms, others were found in sealed compartments after sensor interference. They could never be moved. Every attempt to remove one resulted in failure of the surrounding control interface within 6 seconds. Then, if touched directly, the chair would vanish. Not evaporate, vanish, leaving no trace and often corrupting up to 24 hours of system memory in the local feed. That was the new deterrent. Not fire, not steel. Repetition. Every time the directive was ignored, when a junior officer thought maybe, just maybe, this time was different, a relay node began to stall. Latency appeared first in diagnostics, then communications, then environmental control. One by one, subsystems slowed, not enough to crash, but enough to break confidence. And when the latency was finally purged, the system architecture would show a new line of code, always inserted into the power distribution loop. The same word, each time, seated. DEC hadn't disappeared. That was the mistake the Dalek made early on. They had searched for presence in the form of physical signals, ships, life signs. They hadn't understood that his final act wasn't escape. It was displacement. The Ark hadn't left the system. It had redefined what it meant for something to be present. The moment it finished its recursion cycle, it was no longer part of space. It was part of logic. DEC didn't vanish into the stars. He vanished into the decision tree. And every time a Dalek system rebuilt itself, it rebuilt the option to see him. Final training simulations at the Academy included one looped scenario. It was visual only, non-interactive. A sensory room, full resolution, full fidelity. A Dalek officer steps onto an unfamiliar bridge. Not hostile, not armed, just foreign. The lights dim automatically. A human is already seated in the command chair facing the main screen, calm, relaxed. The officer approaches and calls out. No response. The human turns slowly, locks eyes, and says, "Nice ship." The room goes dark. The system blinks. And when the display resets, the bridge is empty. No human, no console lights, no chair. Just silence, and a blank command line that will never resolve. That's the last lesson. Humans do not need permission to enter a system. They only need to be seen once. And if they smile, you're already too late. What would you have done if you were on that bridge, faced with a human who smiled and said, "Nice ship," just before your entire system unraveled? Would you scan? Would you speak? Or would you run? Let us know your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button.